A major rabbi in New York was approached by Zionist Israeli agents shortly after the so-called Monsey stabbing incident. Back in December of 2019, an attacker stabbed 5 people at a rabbi's home in the US state of New York. The rabbi, known as Chaim Rottenberg, criticized Tel Aviv for taking advantage of the situation. Hi, I'm Mariam Azarcher. This is Inside Israel, and the following video will tell you what you need to know.
Die Gelegenheit, sind sie raus in die ganze Welt, sind viel mehr schreckliche Bakrein, und die will ich raus in die Gas, wenn raus sind da, mit der Chakalusen, als die Areilen sollen mich nicht treffen, die sollen mich kennen, aber man kennt sich nicht aussieht. Wir riefen alle Medienes bei Eulen, wer ist noch in der Jüdische, nicht die jüdische Medien, die nicht jüdische Medien, haben geoffert, sie geben alles und tieren alles, wo es soll kommen auf die meiste
Anti-Zionism dates back to 1890, way before the illegal inception of Israel into Palestinian lands. It began with the ultra-Orthodox community, which makes up 12% of the Israeli population. Many of them were living in pre-1948 Palestine before the inception of Israel that same year. Now, more than ever, the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel, which has strong ties to Jews living abroad, especially in the West, is being more active in opposing Israel. Just recently, the most fiercely anti-Zionist rabbi in the world, Grand Rabbi Zalman Teitelbaum, has made a visit to Jerusalem al-Quds and has distributed $5 million to 150 anti-Zionist associations across Israel. Zalman Teitelbaum is the leader of the Satmar Hasidic dynasty, which is part of the ultra-Orthodox community. The Satmar ideology holds that there should not be a Jewish state, and the Jews should remain in exile until the redemption or coming of the Messiah. The Satmar community view the Zionist Jews who came from Europe as illegal settlers. Thus, they do not believe in Zionism and reject Israel. The community also does not take part in the voting process during elections, and its members do not run for office. There are over 150,000 followers of the Satmar Hasidic tradition in Israel alone. Rabbi Zalman Teitelbaum is famous for calling on all Jews to refrain from Israel, not to support it, and disavowed Zionism and all that it stands for in a speech in New York in 2017. This is only one major incident of Jews turning away from Israel. In the beginning of 2020, Rabbi Meir Hirsch from the ultra-Orthodox Neturei Karta sect angered the regime in Israel by addressing the gathered crowd in the occupied West Bank during a peace conference. He and his followers are originally from Jerusalem al-Quds and have acknowledged living in the state of Palestine before the inception of Israel on Palestinian lands. During the speech, Zionist settlers barged into the auditorium where the speech had been given and made insults towards him. This and other incidents have added to the momentum of those Jews in Israel and outside of Israel who are disassociating themselves from Israel and what it stands for.
On the streets of Tel Aviv, we asked Israelis several questions. We started out with this question. Why do you believe that more and more Jews inside and outside of Israel are distancing themselves from Israel? And
היהדות זה, כידוע, זה דת עם תורה. ציונות זה להפך, זה בשביל לעשות יהודים שיהיו איך שזה, שיהיו נוצרים, שיהיו מה שזה, בלי קשר לדת. אז אין לזה, אצלנו העיקר זה הדת, אז זה סתירה גמורה.
אני יהודי שמנסה לשמר את המורשת היהודית, את האמונה היהודית ואת היהדות בכללותה. כי מדינת ישראל לא מייצגת את מה שהיהדות מייצגת, והיא עושה הרבה בעיות ליהודים בעולם, גם מבחינה אידיאולוגית, שהיא מכחישה ומשכיחה מהעם היהודי את היהדות שלו ואת האמונה שלו, וגם מבחינה פיזית היא מסכנת את כל היהודים בכל העולם, כי מדינת ישראל בעולם מדברת בשם העם היהודי, וממילא כל מה שהם עושים נגד כל איזה אומה שהיא, אז זה כאילו בשם כל יהודי באשר הוא בעולם, וזה מסכן אותו, כי הוא לא רוצה להיות מזוהה עם דברים שמסכנים את היהודי בכל העולם.
אז אני אומרת לך, כי יש הבדלים, אנחנו רואים קודם כל את המחירים. יש פה גם בעיה של העבודות, בעיה של למצוא עבודה. אני גרה פה כבר בעפולה 4 חודשים, אני חדשה פה וחשבתי שאני צ'יק צ'ק מוצאת עבודה ואני עד עכשיו לא מוצאת עבודה. לא תגידי שיש איזו סיבה ממש מסוימת שאני לא יכולה למצוא. וזה אחת הסיבות גם שאנשים הרבה מובטלים והם אין להם משכורות. המשכורות הן פשוט, גם המשכורות שנותנים זה
אין לי כל כך מושג, אני רק יודע שפחות או יותר הם אנטי-ישראל או אנטי-ממסדיים. יש להם את הממסד שלהם וזה. הם לא מקבלים שום, הם עצמם בחוק שיש להם את החוקים שלהם, יש להם הכל משלהם.
אני חושב, בראייה שלי, הם רוצים להגדיל את מדינת ישראל. שטחים שכביכול על פי היהדות היו שלנו, שעל פי הציונות הם אומרים שהם שלנו, אז הם הולכים כביכול, הם לוקחים דברים שקשורים ליהדות, ואז הם מקצינים את זה כביכול להגדיל את מדינת ישראל, את השטחים, איך אומרים, קווים של 47 שהיה, כל הדברים, 48, את הזה. לדעתי זה כאילו הם רוצים להרחיב את מדינת ישראל כמה שיותר שטחים לקחת, שיהיה כאילו מדינת ישראל ככל שיותר תגדל, והשטחים שכביכול קשורים לערבים שיהיו של היהודים. כי מזה כביכול לפי היהדות היה.
Thanks for staying with us. Don't go anywhere because there's a lot more to the program, and we'll be right back after the break. Welcome back. I would also like to welcome Israeli author and journalist Gideon Levy from Israel to the show. Welcome, Mr. Levy. Now, it seems that Jews were opposed to Zionism from the very beginning. So when did this movement start?
Anti-Zionism starts with Zionism. I mean, the moment that Zionism was born, there were also Jews who were anti-Zionist from two kinds, very leftist Jews and ultra-Orthodox Jews. And there were two movements who were both anti-Zionist in Europe.
Well, on that note, what does Israel use to justify its inception into the region to begin with?
Without Zionism, there wouldn't be Israel. And Israel was created on the basis of this ideology, namely that the Jews have the right for self-determination and their place should be in Palestine, and that Palestine should become a Jewish state. And all this happened thanks to Zionism. I think that on the way there were many, many mistakes and a lot of misjustice.
Interesting. So you're saying that Israel's inception is unjust in its very nature. Now, Mr. Levy, who is leading the global anti-Zionist movement?
The ultra-Orthodox, one part of the ultra-Orthodox really believed that creating the state of Israel was a mistake and the Jews should not have a state of their own. The ultra-Orthodox, at least one part of the ultra-Orthodox, is against the state of Israel and believe that Jews should not run a state by their own because this might risk them. And according to their belief, or at least part of them believe, that it's not the time yet, that only when Messiah will come, there will be a Jewish state, but until then, Jews should live wherever they live without having a state by their own. But that's only one part of the Orthodox Jews. There are other Orthodox Jews who are not Zionists, but they are not anti-Zionist. And in this case, it's a little different because it's one thing to be non-Zionist and it's another thing to be anti-Zionist.
So Zionism came into being in the early 19th century, right? Now, why did the Zionists choose Palestine to incept Israel on? I mean, were there other options?
Look, the idea of Zionism started already in the 19th century, when Herzl thought that the Jews should have their own state. There were some other ideas. Palestine was not the only place. There was an idea to create it in Uganda. There was another idea to create it in Argentina, in Russia, in many places. But it all starts with Herzl and with the belief that Jews should have their own state and their own self-determination.
Thank you, Mr. Levy. Gideon Levy, a journalist and author from Israel. Now, the trend and growth of anti-Zionism inside Israel is starting to become a nuisance for the regime. This is at least according to this exclusive interview with Rabbi Meir Hirsch, the leader of the Neturei Karta movement in Jerusalem, Al-Quds.
בגלל שהאנטישמיות הציונית בעצם גורמת שנאה לכל יהודי ויהודי בעולם כולו. ורוצים יותר ויותר להתרחק מהם, לא להיות בסיכון עכשווי. בעצם הציונות באה לעקור את הדת היהודית מהעם היהודי, וזאת המלחמה שלנו, כי אנחנו היהודים האותנטיים, ורוצים למנוע בכל מחיר את הסכנה הזאת לעם היהודי. תחת כובש אכזרי, ואנחנו מצפים ליום שהשלטון פה בארץ יחזור לפלסטינאים. אנחנו לא דוגלים בפתרון של שני מדינות לשני עמים. זה פשוט פתרון לא הגיוני ולא קביל, מכיוון שהארץ הזאת הייתה בשליטה של הפלסטינאים קרוב ל-1500 שנה, והם הבעלים הלגיטימיים היחידים של הארץ הזאת. והיה לנו יחסי שכנות טובה עם השכנים הפלסטינאים כל השנים. הציונות גרמה לשנאה שיש היום נגד יהודים רק בגלל הפשעים האכזריים שלהם נגד העם הפלסטיני. ואנחנו דורשים בצדק שהמדינה תבוטל ותיעלם, והשלטון יחזור לשלטון הפלסטיני, שאנחנו נוכל לחיות תחתו בשוויון זכויות מלאה. אנחנו לא עובדים במקצועיות, אנחנו עובדים לפי דברי הנבואה שהנביאים ניבאו לנו, שהציונות בעצם תיעלם. יש לי מילה אחרונה. לאחרונה בעולם מקבל יותר ויותר תאוצה העניין של אנטי-ציונות זה אנטישמיות. אנחנו רוצים להדגיש בצורה הברורה ביותר שאנטי-ציונות זה לא אנטישמיות, אנטי-ציונות זה בעצם עקירת העם היהודי משורשיו, אנטי-ציונות זה בעצם אנטי-רצח ודיכוי אכזרי של אחינו הפלסטינאים, ואנטי-ציונות זה בעצם השיטה הנכונה של העם היהודי האותנטי לדורותיו.
תודה רבה לך.
תודה לכם. מפנימה יותר ויותר את הסכנה המיידית של הפעולות הציוניות ברחבי מזרח התיכון, ויותר ויותר מתרחקים מהם בגלל הפעילויות הבלתי אחראיות שלהם.
The United Nations General Assembly passed the UNGA Resolution 3379 in November 1975, which declared that Zionism is a form of racism. And more recently, according to a poll by the US-based Pew Research Center, the majority of the Orthodox Jews inside Israel are actually anti-Zionist.
United Nations General Assembly Resolution 3379 was adopted on 10th November 1975 by a vote of 72 to 35 with 32 abstentions, determined that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. Since then, Israel has tried ever so hard to link Zionism with Judaism, and thus claim that anyone who is anti-Zionism is also an anti-Semite. This argument, although hard to sell in Jewish communities inside Israel, was easily sold to Western governments, who then imposed such rules in their everyday society. Anti-Zionism remains rampant. According to a poll by the US-based Pew Research Center, the majority of Orthodox Jews inside Israel are actually anti-Zionists. At least 67% of all ultra-Orthodox Jews say that they are anti-Zionist, according to the Pew Research Center. Since 1948, however, the majority of the ultra-Orthodox community maintains a rejectionist position, refusing all funding from Tel Aviv and abstaining from taking part in the political process. They believe that Zionism is out to replace the Jewish faith and the observance of the religion in its abstract and historic context. Hence, Israel is not kosher under Jewish law. As a result, the community says that as a collective punishment, they have been marginalized from the rest of Israeli society for decades. In turn, this marginalization has reflected upon Jews living outside of the US, where this anti-Zionism movement flourishes.
Eric Wahlberg now joins us from Canada. Mr. Wahlberg is a journalist specializing in the Middle East, Central Asia, and Russia. Welcome to the show, Mr. Wahlberg. Now, anti-Zionism is a trending topic. How do people of the Jewish faith view Zionism?
Well, originally, all Jews mostly were against Zionism, and especially the ultra-Orthodox, who say it's sacrilege to force your re-entry into the Holy Land. So this is something that should come at end times when God wants to send Jews back to the Holy Land, so-called Holy Land. but that has broken down over time with the creation of Israel. Some Orthodox Jews became strong Zionists. So they dropped that belief, and only a few Orthodox Jewish groups like Neturah Kartai are strongly against the existence of Israel. But Satmar is the largest Jewish organization in the US, and it is still very critical of Israel and not really a strong supporter. So it's a very mixed attitude of different Jewish sects toward Israel now. You can't make a blanket generalization any longer.
So what roles are the anti-Zionist groups outside Israel playing in portraying to the world a side of Israel that is less shown in, say, the mainstream media?
Yes, anti-Zionist groups in the U.S. with Jewish participation, or there are a few tiny Jewish groups that are specifically independent Jewish voices, for instance, that strongly protest Israel. They have certainly made some difference, more among students that are more open and are more concerned with social justice. There's not very much in the mainstream media that criticizes Israel, so really it's not a very optimistic situation at this point, that even though the crimes are exposed, the UN resolutions, but the main actors, US, Canada, Australia, these colonial countries, and of course Israel, they vote against these resolutions. So it's really not a very good situation right now with respect to educating people.
So there's a growing anti-Zionism activism on a global scale. Now, has this type of activism achieved its goals?
As I said, 90% of Jews support Israel in spite of its atrocities. So I presume that they see Israel as a safe haven, even though it's clearly not a safe haven. Only really 10% of Jews, although it's slightly increasing in the past few years as Zionist Israeli atrocities have increased and become worse, more and more Jews are speaking out. There are groups in the US especially that are protesting and that try to interfere with Jewish Zionist propaganda to send Jews to Israel to live or to study and to promote Zionism. So again, 90% of Jews still support Israel. So until that changes, not much is going to change.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. Wahlberg. That was journalist Mr. Wahlberg from Canada. It's now time to look at the news stories from Israel. Globes. Tel Aviv ranked world's 20th most expensive city. Haaretz. In Israel, indoctrination starts in kindergarten. Haaretz. Israel's poorest pupils lag behind richest by 4 years, study finds. Ynet. Apple's Siri calls Rivlin president of Zionist occupation. Times of Israel. Knesset set to ban Arab MK as Blue and White confirms it backs disqualification. As we saw, the growing anti-Zionism comes from within Jewish communities inside and outside of Israel. The movement is older than Israel itself, and the goal is clear: to make evident that Zionism is not Judaism and that Israel is not Jewish. Now, will Tel Aviv leave this movement alone? So far, it doesn't seem like that. And that ends this edition of Inside Israel. Let's hear what you have to say about this. Tweet to us at inside_Israel. See you next time.